Hello everybody and welcome to Chapter 11 of my TearRing Saga Champions of Utena low turn count playthrough. We're now using Holmes' army, and controlling Holmes on the world map has a key difference to controlling Runan. While Runan is only capable of moving directly towards the next objective, Holmes has free roam while on the world map. This allows him to move into various skirmishes that show up on the map, which are optional battles. If you were paying attention at the end of the last video, you will have noticed the first skirmish spawning in an Azura swamp next to where Holmes is starting here. I am counting turns spent in skirmishes in my turn count in this run, so I'm going to be avoiding these skirmishes as much as possible. Those of you who are a bit familiar with this game might be wondering why I am going to Chapter 11 in this video, because it is possible to delay this map, or even skip it entirely, which is what happens in an incomplete recruitment run. It is actually possible to complete this map in 8 turns rather than the 10 that I'm going to do it in, as long as you leave it until after Chapter 15. So there are 2 reasons that I'm not doing this. The first, less important reason is that it just appeals to my brain to have all of the chapters in the correct order. Much more importantly though, starting from this point, skirmishes start to spawn from certain points on the map. In this case they will spawn from where we're going, where Chapter 11 is, and also from where Chapter 12 is. Each skirmish has a 20% chance of spawning each time I move to a new space on the map, which is why I am saving every time I successfully move without causing spawns to appear. If I was to leave Chapter 11 until after Chapter 15, I would have to leave it open and actively spawning skirmishes all the way through Chapters 12, 13, 14, and 15, at which point a second skirmish spawn would open up near Chapter 16. That would mean I would then have to anti-rig 2 skirmish spawn points all the way back down to Chapter 11, followed by anti-rigging a single skirmish all the way back up to Chapter 16. And that is a lot of extra saving and possible resetting that I didn't want to put either myself or you viewers through. So I have to work with what I've got, and that means that it might be a little bit trickier, but it also means I get to exercise my strategic creativity a little bit more, and maybe show off some strategies that might be slightly more interesting to watch for people who are already veterans of this game. Okay, that's enough about why we're here in the first place. Let's start talking about the preparations I've been doing for this tricky map. The first thing I've done is a little bit of shopping as I come along, around the saving on every tile. I bought a few durability boosters in the form of a miracle charm and a leather shield. And both of these are ultimately for Junie, because she needs to see a fair bit of combat during the course of this clear. We also picked up an iron bow for Holmes, so that he has a fairly light and inexpensive weapon to use up when he needs to see combat during the map. As far as my unit deployment goes, I am going to be relying fairly heavily on my magical units during this map. As I discussed in Chapter 8, movement-based maps with narrow one-tile-wide corridors are really difficult to deal with, and this is in fact one of those. So I need the ability to kill over the heads of my units that need to be moving their full movement every turn. The enemy units in this map tend to be pretty physically bulky, so it's difficult for physical 2 range to do much against them. This map would have been a whole lot trickier to do if I had chosen Naron early rather than Lee, because this map is also an indoor map, which would make most of Naron's useful attributes pretty worthless, and I really need multiple magical units to kill these enemies. Martel is also being deployed on this map, but similarly to Naron, because she's forced to dismount, her combat stats aren't really all that good, so even though she has 11 swords, she's not capable of one-rounding anything on this map. The actual objective of this map is a new one, we need to rout the enemy, but we also need to open the one treasure chest on this map before the chapter will end. Because Holmes' fixed deployment slot is 11 moves away from the treasure chest, we need to deploy Junie as close to the top of our deployment as we possibly can, and make sure she doesn't lose any movement throughout this entire map. To that end, we also need to make sure that Holmes sticks right behind her, because there is a door in the way that she would need to lose a turn to open herself. So instead we have Holmes do it. We also need some combat units to accompany them, so there's an enormous amount of movement requirements in this chapter. We have a couple of new recruits on this map, although one of them is going to be stuck in her prison cell for the entire duration. So let's talk about Samson first. Samson is a fighter, kind of like Barbs, except that he's 3 levels higher than Barbs, so he's that much closer to promotion. He also has pretty good base stats. In particular, his speed is exactly what it would be if Bartz was leveled up to equal his level and got speed every single time, which is pretty unlikely with Bartz's 35% speed growth. Samson's growths are also overall better than Bartz's, although he'll usually have a slight strength deficit at equal levels. Samson also has the Frontiersman skill rather than Bartz's Mountaineer skill, and Frontiersman is generally more useful throughout the game. All of these reasons combine to mean that I generally prefer to use Samson over Bartz, and in this map Samson is going to be making good use of his strong combat and the killer axe that he comes with in order to take out a large number of the enemy brigands that we have to deal with. The prisoner in the room is Alicia, and she is a mage, the same type of mage that Marouge is, although her personal tome is a thunder tome rather than a wind tome. Alicia's personal tome is called Dire Thunder, and players of Heroes or Thracia 776 will know what that means. It's a brave 1-2 range magical weapon. This means that Alicia is very good at one-round KOing any enemy that she can reach, although that's not very many due to her low movement as a mage. I'd like to draw your attention briefly to Vega's movement here, because he loses a tile on this turn. This is because next turn reinforcements are going to appear directly in front of Holmes, and we need to leave the space behind Holmes free for one of our magic units to move in and one-round KO the reinforcement so that Holmes can have his full movement on this turn. This does make it somewhat tricky for Vega to keep up and be where he needs to be at the end of this map. But he manages in the end, so it's something that we just have to deal with. On this enemy phase, Junie needs to dodge at least one of these attacks, even with her Miracle Charm, because she needs to keep that Miracle Charm intact also for what happens at the end of the map. At the end of the last turn, I had Samson stand on one of the reinforcement spawn points, which means that that reinforcement isn't going to spawn in. Blocking reinforcement spawns like this is a very nice mechanic, and I'm going to be doing it a couple more times during this map. We now have to worry about a pretty dangerous part of the map for our lock touch units, because one of the enemies here has a killer axe, in addition to a leather shield, and that means that if he gets a crit, he will kill either Junie or Holmes. We much prefer him to attack Holmes, so that he is then in range of our magic units to be killed next turn. To that end, I usually have Lee move up and trade Junie a leather shield, which I find inclines him more to go for Holmes. If I don't do this trade, I have found that it's much more of a toss-up who he targets. But unfortunately on this attempt, I forgot to do that trade, which could also have saved me a herb use if I had Lee heal afterwards. Luckily for me though, in this attempt the Killer Axe guy still went for Holmes and managed to not get a crit, so we're all good there. Another important thing that happened on this turn was that Samson got a critical hit on one of the 2 hunters coming through the corridor near him. This critical hit is unfortunately a necessary critical hit, because Samson needs to deal with both of these hunters as soon as possible so that he can stay ahead of Junie and clear the way for her a bit. I spent quite a lot of time investigating how Samson's movement affected the movement of these enemies and the reinforcements, and none of the ways I looked at worked to get Samson ahead of Junie and both of them through into the last phase of the map. So we just have to rely on this critical hit here. It's not strictly necessary because you can still complete the map in 10 turns if Junie is ahead of Samson, but it makes the remainder of the map much less reliable. So I decided to wait for this critical hit, and then on this upcoming turn use the save staff in order to rig a critical hit on the second hunter, just so the rest of the map could be more reliable. At this point in the map, Junie and Holmes are in an area that's pretty clogged with a lot of enemies, including the Killer Axe enemy from last turn, which we have Lee deal with on account of his leather shield. Marouge also continues to be helpful here, one round KOing things with Wundergust. On the other hand, Vega is just demonstrating how difficult these enemies are to kill with physical attacks, so Holmes ends up having to help out and finish off one of the enemies so that Junie can carry on moving her full movement. There are still quite a few enemies left alive here, however, so this is going to be a fairly difficult enemy phase to survive. It's very easy for either Junie or Holmes to just die if too many of the enemy attacks connect here. As I mentioned before, we are now using the save staff for the very first time to rig a critical hit on a hunter from Samson's Killer Axe. As save staff uses go, this one doesn't save a bunch of turns. All it does is add a bit more reliability to the rest of the map, at the cost of needing to rig one critical hit, which is a worthy trade-off in this chapter and probably saved me many hours of resetting. Okay, now that we're in a bit of a lull and most of the important things have happened, let's talk about the remaining 2 units that we picked up in Holmes' army. The first is Shigen, who I did not deploy here. He is a Myrmidon like Vega, and he's pretty damn good at combat as well. Unlike Vega, his personal weapon, Dullahan, is not focused on increasing his combat power. It's quite heavy and has fairly low accuracy. However, while it is equipped, if he is ever reduced to 0 HP, one use of Dullahan is consumed in order to resurrect him with full HP, and this also interrupts the combat. This is a very powerful effect, and Shigen can be used as bait in many situations that would be dangerous for other units. Shigen comes with the Adept and Seafarer skills, giving him a nice combat proc and utility on sea maps, which are fairly common in Holmes' route. And now, I've been saying Holmes this, Holmes that for all the map, let's actually talk about the second main lord of the game. Holmes has pretty decent base stats, but the unfortunate thing about him is that he is locked to bows until he promotes. This is not too big of an issue, really, because he's good at providing chip damage, or even one-round KOing from range. But it does come into play in some maps later on, where it's difficult for him to clear his own path. Holmes comes with a longbow, which is a 2 to 3 range weapon, and this allows him to get safe damage against enemy 2 range units, if necessary. Holmes also has the Seafarer skill, and he additionally comes with Lock Touch, giving him thief utility on top of his decent combat. All in all, I'd say Holmes is probably a bit better than Runan, although still not the most amazing unit in the game. Our thieves have now managed to break through most of the enemies in this map, and Holmes is going to sit in a position where he can one-round KO one of the reinforcement hunters coming up from behind. Vega is basically at the far reach of where he can be on this turn in order to be useful when we need him at the end of the map. so unfortunately neither of my mages are anywhere near close enough to be able to help out there. This is kind of unfortunate because, like all the other enemies, the enemies in the final room of this map have really high defense, and I would have liked to have some magic to punch through, but we're just going to have to deal with it with Vega and Samson. With how we've been doing a mad dash in order to clear the way for our really good combat units and our thieves, the rest of my army is kind of spread thin to deal with the mass reinforcements that have been appearing. In particular, I made a bit of a blunder with Mel on the last turn. I accidentally tried to have her attack with a Levin sword thinking she was Martel, which leads to her getting attacked on this turn. And Marouge is also in a lot of danger. He gets knocked down to 1 HP on this enemy phase. Fortunately, the AI does not manage to gang up on any of my at-risk units, and we survive the enemy phase intact. This upcoming enemy phase is a big part of why I wanted Samson to be ahead of Junie, because he needs to one-round KO the enemy brigand who's coming down the corridor. If Junie was ahead, she would do absolutely no damage to him, and we would then have to kill him in order for Junie to continue walking with her full movement, and that's a big strain on my units who are already being stretched a bit. This way, everyone just gets to continue walking after Samson effortlessly kills him on enemy phase. The reinforcements have also finally stopped coming, so we are tidying up the remaining enemies in the upper part of the map with anyone who can manage to deal some damage. And that includes us pulling out Martel's Levin sword for the first time, although she disappointingly manages to miss her first attack with it. On the other hand, that RNG string does mean that Martel ends up picking up a magic point here, so that's something to be grateful for. This hunter doesn't have any other good targets, so he is going to suicide on Martel on enemy phase anyway. With Lee tidying up one last brigand, there are hardly any enemies left on the map. So I'm going to take this time to describe how the 8-turning of this chapter works. Actually, just a moment. Samson gets a critical hit here, but that is in fact not necessary. He would have one-round KO'd easily anyway. Anyway, the 8th turn. So, if you leave this map until after chapter 15, as I mentioned in the intro, you can get a dancer, as well as access to the mountaineer skill for your thief. At that point, it is also very possible to have a promoted swordmaster, which means that you have extremely powerful physical combat, which will probably be enough to overwhelm the high defenses of the enemies here. Between the dancer and the extra movement that you have, it becomes a lot easier to block off all of the reinforcements along the upper area of the map without losing any movement at all. And you can also send a swordmaster through with a door key rather than worrying about having to escort 2 lock-touch units through the entire chapter. All in all, I expected the 8th turn would be a much easier time, and it wouldn't cost anything extra because I already intend to invest in Mountaineer for several of my units anyway. One interesting thing is that in a run in which you recruit Latina, who's very complicated to recruit, you have to come back to the city of Verge after chapter 15 anyway, so that actually mitigates one of the downsides of waiting for the 8th turn of this chapter, and I think would make it much more attractive on a Latina run than on this run. We have now penetrated the boss room, and Samson is trading his leather shield over to Junie. For some reason, this causes the sellsword escorting the boss to attack Samson rather than Junie, which means that Samson gets an extra attempt to land a critical hit on him and kill him. You might expect me to attack the boss here with Samson, also to get some extra damage on him, but Samson is not capable of one-hit KOing the boss with a critical hit, and dealing any damage to the boss causes him to run to the top of the room and use his healing item, whereas we need him to move down and attack Junie so that he is within reach of Vega on the next player phase. Speaking of the boss, he is perfectly capable of one-hit KOing Junie straight through the leather shield that she now has, which is why Junie needs the Miracle Charm intact in order to be guaranteed to survive this round of combat. It's a bit unfortunate that she missed, because breaking the boss's leather shield might have been helpful, but I'm happy that she managed to dodge his attack, because that saved me buying another Miracle Charm later on. It's important to note that the sellsword cannot one-hit KO Junie as long as she is holding a leather shield. So, because the Miracle Charm completely blocks damage, she is in fact completely safe on that enemy phase, despite ostensibly being able to face two very scary enemies for her. We now have to finish off the boss and his friend here. Unfortunately, Samson didn't manage to land a critical hit on the sellsword, so we have to do it the hard way, using 2 save staff uses to rig 2 critical hits. Vega is unable to reach the sellsword from where he is, so we have to have Samson finish him off and actually get a critical hit this time. He has 31 listed crit here, but if you'll remember from Chapter 2, listed critical and true critical are different. In fact, Samson only has 27 true critical against this enemy, so slightly more than a 1 in 4 chance for success. Vega is somewhat more reliable at finishing off the sellsword, but I decided I would sooner have 2 attempts at getting a critical hit with the killer axe on him, rather than having Vega finish him off, because that would potentially save me a save staff use. Now, I foolishly moved Mel over to the left of Marouge here, which put her out of Catri's range, so I have to do a quick trade chain using Marouge in order to get the save staff over to Catri for the second save rig here. This second save rig is ever so slightly more reliable, with a nearly 40% chance of a success. We're going to have Holmes chip away at the boss using his iron bow, which puts him in range of being killed off by Vega with a hit and a critical. Vega's crit rate is not as high as Samson's, but he is extremely fast enough to double even the boss, and that means he gets 2 chances at landing it. In addition, Holmes has a 1% true critical that could theoretically go off, and would put the boss in range of being killed by 2 regular hits from Vega. We do it this way round, with Holmes chipping and Vega killing, so that Vega can continue his trek towards level 10, which he is very close to. And once he gets there, he will be able to use the hero crest that Junie pulled out of the treasure chest in order to promote into a swordmaster. So now here we are entering the final combat, and Vega is going to get a pretty bad empty level from this kill, which is unfortunate, but it still completes the chapter in 10 turns. Afterwards, we receive the boss's silver sword as a drop, and that's going to be a very useful and powerful item for the upcoming chapters. Now that this chapter is over, we are one step closer to finally leaving the Kingdom of Welt behind. So that's all, and I will see you next time.